All right. And here we are. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Highlands to Islands. We are very excited for this and for the next episode because we'll be talking about stills. When we originally conceived the idea of it, we cut 2 episodes out because it's a complicated topic. There's loads of different still configurations in use around the world. The whiskey industry alone has a mind-boggling number of ways to use a still and a still configuration in order to create distillate from grain. We've also invited a few folks to join us, and we may see our friend Lew Bryson join us here pretty quick. Brendan McCarron from Glenmorangie Ardbeg was called to Isla at the last minute. He is probably on his flight back to Glasgow right this minute, so we may see him as well. But we are deeply honored to welcome Maggie Campbell from Privateer Rum in Maine. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure. Cameron made me aware of your presence, and then I started digging in. And holy cow, you're a busy gal. I was just reading your bio on the Privateer site earlier this week, and you're studying for your MW as if you don't have enough to do.
Just for fun. It's
Yeah,
fun.
just as a kind of a crazy aside. Yeah. But Cam and I are both studying for WSET 3 Spirits, and you've passed the level 4 diploma. So congratulations on that. We both are getting a very strong sense of what an accomplishment that is. So that's fantastic. And you have a background as a brewer. Clearly, you are pursuing a set of wine knowledge that rivals any on the planet. There are, a couple of hundred MWs in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, the joke we like to say is more people have been into outer space than have become MWs.
So, rarefied company. That's fantastic. So, as we dig into this thing, I'm going to be, and I'm sure Cam will be too, fascinated to hear how that line of reasoning and that particular discipline informs what you do at Privateer, along with your background as a brewer. We've done one show on fermentation, but it wasn't nearly enough. Not for me, not for my level of just curiosity. So I'd like to do a bunch more, and we'd love to have you on again when we talk about fermentation. But we're both pretty curious, just in terms of the still setup at Privateer. Can you kind of walk us through what that looks like and the flow from fermentation through the final heart?
Yeah, absolutely. So we at Privateer, we do double distill everything. That's not always the standard in rum, so it's kind of cool. Our first distillation is a Vendome copper pot still from Louisville, Kentucky. So this is something you would see in a lot of whiskey distilleries, and especially American whiskey distilleries. And, for the first distillation, we really want to bring as much flavor as possible over and really sort of create and prime that core material to really get that final sculpting in the still. So for us, having that big fat pot copper still is fantastic for leaving in as much flavor as possible. We take a very, very small 4 shots cut, heads cut on the first distillation, just a little bitty one. It's something I learned in my cognac training, and it just helps set everything out in the right way. And then we basically run that still until the hydrometer is reading a really low level. So we know that pretty much all the alcohol has been brought over, and what's left over in the pot is just water, dead yeast, and that kind of stuff. So from that first distillation, we'll distill about 1,000 gallons of this fermented molasses beer, which kind of tastes like a sour brown ale, if you will.
Right on. Very cool.
It's very bone dry and tart, which we love. And we'll get out of those 1,000 gallons about 200 gallons of our low wines at about 35, 40% ABV. That goes into our spirit stills. So we have 2 spirit stills. They're clone stills. One is named Baldwin after the civil rights activist, poet, novel writer. And the other one is named Keats after the poet. And they are what are called hybrid stills. So for me, it was a really different experience working on these stills, but they're wonderful because we can pretty much do whatever we want with them. It's basically a big pot still, and then there's a large line arm that goes from the pot, and that line arm can either go directly over to the condenser, so it can be used as just a pot still, or that line arm can be directed down to the bottom of an 8-plate batch single column. And we can control how many plates we have there. So if we want to do 4 plates and kind of mimic a Creole column, which obviously it would be different, but mimic it in a sort of way we can. A lot of bourbons are distilled on single column. Or if we want to do that pure double pot expression, we absolutely can. So for me, it's been amazing to be able to work on a still that has all of those features because my previous job before Privateer was at Germain Robin using a cognac style still, which good luck having a conversation with that still. That still's going to do what it does. You guide it along gently, but I mean, it's very different to be able to say, this is exactly what I want to make today. Which coming from my whiskey background was really different because in whiskey, it was you kind of use the same still the same way to hit the same ABV. You distill it in the same way every day. Whereas in rum, we talk a lot about marks. And so some days we'll actually do a double pot distill, create a mark. That mark, meaning that flavor goes into a barrel. The next day we'll distill it different, and the next day different. And then at the end, we might blend them all together to create a lot of complexity.
And are you aiming for, with each of those marks, are you aiming for specific flavor outlines? I mean, you're not aiming for the same outline and getting there in different ways. You're aiming for specific overall flavors from each of those marks. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. A different, if we're doing what we call our rich fine mark, we know that we're going to get a lot of deep, dark, earthy flavors, but the structure on the palate will be pretty linear, and it'll have a lot of top note, delicate aroma, and still keep some of that back palate. Whereas if we were doing one of our rich, thick marks, we know that would be a very heavy, very oily, texturally driven, kind of very umami driven spirit type.
That makes me really think that we actually need to bring you back on for another conversation in blending as well, because having come off the back of this conversation, something that we practice at Ardbeg is wholly maturing spirits in different casks to specifically create essentially that same thought process, which is create marks, right? Variations that are then utilized to create something, right? So take whereas at Ardbeg we'll take some new made spirit and we'll put it into Oloroso sherry cask for a whole maturation. Some goes into virgin American oak. Some will go into PX, and then it's about how we use those different marks to create the whiskey. So it's a lot of the same line of thinking, but genuinely coming from the aspect of distillation. I think that's beautiful.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it was for me. It was really different. Coming from a lot of my background in American whiskey was distill it to this exact proof, 160, put it in a new American oak barrel, and like you said, you guys use all the nuance of the different casks and the different cooperage and the different generations of casks to achieve different flavors. And we're combining that as well as these different marks and distilling to these different proofs and different expressions and even different fermentations that are intended for a certain type of distillation that then creates this one unique flavor, all out of the same base ingredient, the molasses. So it's kind of fun and cool. So it's taught me a lot about still design in a very different way.
I can well imagine. And you'd mentioned you had a whiskey background as well. What can you let us know what that background is?
Yeah, I know Lew Bryson's probably running a little late today because he was doing an online seminar with one of my biggest influences, Todd Leopold of Leopold Brothers.
Oh, very cool. That's great.
Yeah, so Todd and I met back when his distillery was still in Michigan. So I was really lucky to get to know his team a little bit. So his team had come out a little bit before him to start kind of growing the Colorado market. And at the time I was a fine wine buyer. I was a Spanish Portuguese wine specialist at a store. And I was the one who kind of knew a bit about spirits. So I got asked quite a bit about these things. And I got to meet Eric Harboe, his assistant distiller at the time. And we got to become friends. And I was really passionate about quality brewing and distilling and best practices and a lot of stuff they're excited about. So when they did move their distillery to Denver and opened their first site, we were really lucky that not a lot of people knew they were there yet. And we got to tour with them and actually meet Todd and get to know him and become friends. And he and my husband have become very fast friends. And he was sort of the person who encouraged me to actually go to Siebel, where he graduated from, and get my diploma in distillation technology so that I had a piece of paper that said, this 23-year-old is not full of it. She actually knows what she's doing, which was very helpful. And he's been huge in just pushing me to do what's next, accept the big task. I called him when Privateer called me and I said, I don't know rum. Do I know enough to run a distillery? And he was like, have you met some of these people? You're just fine. And really pushed me to do it. So yeah, we've been close with him and his family for a long time. And, you know, I say like his wedding is one of my favorite memories because it was just really intimate and so cool. So many cool distilleries, and he distilled custom spirits for it. And it was really amazing. So,
Wow.
Awesome.
yeah.
Wow, that sounds amazing. So where is Siebel Institute? I don't know the answer to that.
So Siebel's in Chicago, and it's sort of the top brewing school. And it was cool because it was like the head of Breese Malts was in that class, and it was just great to meet so many people. And we crossed over with some of the brewing people as well. And we learned a ton about malting, which I was really passionate about. So for me, in my career, my original plan was to open a rye whiskey distillery. And I thought, you know, back in 2006, like, oh, people are going to want American rye, and no one's really laying down like really old stock. There's a lot of bulk purchasing going on, but like, I really want to do this. And so that was the original plan. And of course, life took over, and now my life is rum, and I couldn't imagine it being any different. I love it, but definitely I got to have my share of adventures in whiskey back in the day. And it was actually Scotland I was there when I was 20 and stumbled into a distillery and thought, oh, this is something people do. I could do this.
Nice.
Sorry,
Cam, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, you know, just to kind of tie it back to something that you had said a little bit earlier as well about how your setup at Privateer is you know, kind of non-traditional. Well, I look at, you know, when you say that you felt like you might not know enough to really take over, you know, operations at a rum distillery, what is traditional in the world of rum in terms of distillation setups? I mean, it seems like as you know, crazy as the world of Scotch whiskey can be, you know, there are almost no rules in rum. So, you know, how have you gone about navigating that?
Yeah.
And what is traditional?
Yeah. For me, it's sort of like, I think of rum as I do whiskey. So in whiskey, there's Japanese whiskey, Indian whiskey, bourbon, Tennessee rye, as well as Scotch. Whereas I'll think of Barbados rum as like, okay, Barbados rum is like Scotch. It's one region that produces rum. So there's actually like pretty good understanding of what Barbados rum is. And whereas if you look at, you know, Martinique, there are rules. And if you look at, you know, other areas, there are some rules around what it is. But yeah, it's definitely different. Yes, exactly. And there's, like you said, a huge variety of experiences. And rum was, you know, I definitely felt as a continental North American distiller pretty removed from it. It took me time and energy to like get down there and build relationships and earn people's trust and get to share that information. Whereas I feel like if I Google about Scotch, I can, you know, see what a Glenmorangie still looks like and see what a Glenfarclas still looks like and get an idea of what I'm tasting and why it tastes that way. Whereas in rum, you know, it just took a lot more work because I think that we don't give the same visibility and time and attention there. So I would say most of the rum professionals I know, like I'm always amazed. I go down there and there's really young kids with like multiple degrees and their parents did this and worked in this distillery. And, it's definitely pretty intimidating, but it's been so wonderful how encouraging and supportive and welcoming and sharing the community is. It's really different than any other distilling community I've been a member in. It is very rare to hear someone say something negative about someone else. Everyone's really rooting for each other. So that's kind of great.
I would absolutely say that as a son of Seattle, Washington, and somebody who absolutely loves rumba, and is lucky and very blessed to have Kate Perry as one of my, very good friends. She speaks incredibly highly of you. She's been somebody who has very much so opened my eyes to the world of rum. I'll never forget. She used to come to this bar I used to run called 611 Supreme, and I did not know that she was allergic to whiskey. She was a regular, was there all the time, and I never got to make her cocktails. She was there to see some of the other bartenders, and I was a bar back. And one day I was just like, "Let me make you a cocktail," and was so incredibly proud of this thing that I had presented to her. And she was like, "What's in it?" And I was like, "Well, it's got this whiskey." She was like, "I can't drink that," So I asked her what she did drink, and she was like, "All rum, all the time." And so she was the person who really started to teach me a little bit about the rum world. And so when you say it's one of the most, like open and caring kind of communities, I absolutely see that from bartending all the way up into production as well.
Very cool. Yeah, it is. It's so warm and open and supportive. And yeah, I would think that everyone would have every reason to be very nervous about whatever this woman's doing. And everyone's excited. They're cool. Mm-hmm. They're really excited about just things being good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As far as the different types of rum distillation setups in the Caribbean, do they tend to follow region? So if you were making a Barbados rum, would that setup be different than Martinique, and then, or does it come down to the individual distilleries in terms of how they decide to set their program up?
Yeah, this is a great question. So in the Jamaican GI, which are the rules around like what is Jamaican rum in Jamaica, exactly. Yes, Zan, Rum Bar Gold, Worthy Park,
so good.
Camden. I like they have such a great community. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So as for their laws, which everyone agreed to in 2016, they don't stipulate what kind of still you have to have. But there is commonly, retorts are common. A blend of pot and column is common. And you do see certain themes sort of emerge in different styles. I would say it's interesting going through distilleries in the Caribbean. Number one, as someone who's used to more of the Scotch American tradition, or I should say continental North American tradition, it was very strange for me to see certain parts of one type of still attached to certain parts of another still. I was like, oh, wow, like that's a Vendome thumper with a Forsyth pot. Like, it's kind of interesting to see like this culture of it's an island and what's there you use. And it's also kind of this history of distillation. You see, in this era, these stills were popular, so they have these. But then in this era, the multi-column came along. So regions that were really expanding at that time, you see that. And it's kind of this history. It's like a still museum throughout the Caribbean of all these different types of still making, all types of different spirits. So yeah, at Appleton, there will be a blend of column distillate with double retort distillate. And that is definitely kind of harkens back to some of the just history of distillation in the area, but as well as even way, way back in the day. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Rumverschnitz. This was like an era where rum was very heavily taxed in a certain part of Europe where rum consumption was really high. So a lot of the distillers who really prized that market made these very funky, strong smelling rums that were meant to be bought as one bottle, but then blended with the local high proof distillate to sort of make this Rumverschnitz. And so the idea of blending pot with column is part of that flavor profile that's just kind of lingered on from history at some places. Of course, some places are doing that, but without any connection to that history. And it's kind of cool to see this, the Armagnac still in the Creole column that makes Agricole AOC. You can see like a little bit of sibling kind of notions there. And it's just really cool to see all these different eras. And I know that right now, somewhat understandably, like big multi-column sort of neutral distillate that's kind of made in bulk is a little less in fashion. And that was a big part of like high yields, flavored rum brands, spiced rum brands, rum that you add essence to, part of the like making that styles of rum that was really efficient volume wise for them. So yeah, throughout sort of the history of the Caribbean and these different regions, there are some regionalities you see. And then there are like the Creole column is going to be very region specific. And some of the pots and retorts in Jamaica are going to be very specific. And of course, there's historical reasons for this, but also I think it's very important, sort of what Cam said and what Kate Perry always preaches is letting the local rum communities decide for themselves, like what their rum identity is. I'm very much kind of against saying like, these are Spanish style rums. Like Puerto Rico is not part of Spain. And you also erase the labor of the people who made it. You're thinking of someone in Spain. You're not thinking of, an artist in Puerto Rico with some really great technical skills doing something really beautiful. So I think that that's like a big one for me is sort of looking at what is Barbados rum. Barbados rum, as all the Barbadian owned and operated distilleries feel, is, unsweetened, no adulterated additives, aged there, use their local water. They kind of have their own protocols for what they feel is the true identity of the region. And then in Haiti, I got to interview Delphine, the CEO from Barbancourt, which was so cool because I feel like I've never read online an accurate description of what their distillery is like. And I really got to nail her down about what the distillery was like. And we talked a little bit about the difference between Clairen and Haitian rum and how they're both rums and they're both from Haiti. But anyone in Haiti knows the difference, even if there's not regulations around it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of cool.
That's awesome. I guess, something that I really was kind of wondering as well, because the term like Spanish style or whatnot, those, like you said, those are antiquated, and at the same time, they kind of have a way of sweeping under a rug, the contributions and the hard work of the people that are, that actually, live in the regions where these rums are being produced. So why was it that originally, or when we first started learning a lot about rum, that designations like Spanish style were applied to these countries that are rum producing countries that are obviously not Spain?
I think that in a lot of ways, the way we talk about rum in the rum world is still through this colonial lens. It has not been decolonized in our discussion and our awareness. And I think that that's a part of it. Who was writing about it at the time and what their cultural lens was tells me a lot. I got to go to this distillers conference in Jamaica, and with all these great rum distillers, from all over the Caribbean. It was amazing. And I realized that week, like everything I've ever read in continental North America about dunder is inaccurate. Every single thing I've ever read. It's not a mystery. It's not even hard to understand, but the way it's recorded just isn't accurate. And I think that a couple things come into play. Number one, like we give time and attention to those things that we value, and do we subconsciously devalue rum and then not accurately report it or take the time to get to know it or treat it with that same awareness that we would if we were reporting about, Scotch or bourbon, that, I think a lot of the general public holds in different esteem than they do rum. And I think that the history of, Spain and France and Britain in the Caribbean does inform us of some things that have had lasting effects. But I think that we've sort of outgrown calling, Jamaican rum British. Jamaica is not part of Britain. They worked pretty damn hard to make sure that wasn't the case. And letting them decide like what is Jamaican rum and what makes it special. And Haitian rum kind of has nothing to do with, some other French islands. And Jamaican rum doesn't have much to do with, other British islands. So it's always tricky.
So you had mentioned a couple of times Creole column, and I'm not familiar with how that's different from a standard column still. Can you kind of walk through that a little bit?
Yeah. It's like a 4-plate column still that is used in the production of AOC rum agricole in Martinique. And so it's very, very, very similar to an Armagnac still.
Okay. And you'd mentioned that you had, obviously, your experience at Germain Robin. Using a still like that, I like how you put it, it makes what it wants to make. Does that, in terms of how that prepares you for the situation you're in now, my guess is, and obviously tell me when I'm off the rails here, that the skill set that you develop in working with a still that doesn't really care what you want it to do, does that translate into the problem solving and the sort of the creative application of the distiller's art to a somewhat uncooperative still set? How did that experience inform what you do now and how you run the stills at Privateer, if it did at all?
Totally. It totally did. I think we talk a lot about the distiller's tingle at work, where you get like a vibe and you're like, okay, I have to do this. Because that still was like it would have been like 100 years ago. Sure. It didn't have any sensors or alarms or anything. Like, you really just kind of got a vibe that you had to go check it. One of my favorite things to kind of tell is with that still. So my still now, we put the wash into it, we turn it on, and as it begins to warm up, vapor rises up and it hits a sensor. And when the vapor becomes a certain temperature, and I can expect it to start coming over in the still, an alarm goes off. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. My still's about to start. Let me adjust my heat. At Germain Robin, we had a jingle bell on a piece of fabric with flax. And we climbed up precariously to the swan's neck and stuck it on the swan's neck. And then when the still got warm, it would melt and fall, and you knew to go adjust the still. So
wow.
it taught me a lot about how to sense it was coming, to get that natural feel, the natural rhythm, get really in tune with the still. And to basically be prepared for what it's going to do. So, that still obviously, like, if the weather's cool, it ran differently. If it was hot, it ran differently. If I controlled the heat, when to push heat and how mattered. But the still I have now, it's like, you want to be so gentle in finessing it and getting those results, because it really responds to you in a really beautiful way. Like, big ups Christian Carl, Black Forest German Engineering. They've done a great job. So for me, it was really good for getting those ingrained senses of how to distill with zero guidance. And now that I have lovely little alarms and, pressure indicators and all sorts of stuff, it can really help me just kind of go off my natural senses and use that as an extra guide.
I would think it'd be very difficult to go the other way, to go from
the
setup you have now to a cognac still. Yeah, that I just can't even imagine. And it's kind of nice when you've got a fundamental skill set that's formed in the cauldron of that kind of a setup, where it's somewhat primitive. It resists your efforts to control it, and you sort of get what you get. When you move into a situation that's a bit more modern, I meant to ask you, when was Privateer built? I mean, how recently was the gear that you use now actually made?
Yeah, great question. So Privateer was built in 2011. Okay. I joined them in 2012. So our first still, is almost 10 years old. So pretty new in the world of stills. And the Vendome still came in 2014. So, okay. So they are pretty new, made for us, specific for us. And that's been really lovely. As I said, having worked on other stills where it's like, Oh yeah, just mix up some pancake paste, put it on that seam. When it warms up, it'll puff up. It'll be fine. This is much different.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yes, it's thank God safety first.
Right. And do you get to harvest the pancakes off the side and then like have them for breakfast or
Oh
anything?
my
Or
gosh!
no?
One morning I woke up and this is like the absinthe hoga still up in Eagle Rock Ranch. And I woke up and I was staying in the distiller's house across the way, and a deer had like started eating the pancake mix off the cooled still because it had sat out overnight and cooled.
Wow.
The deer was eating off the still, and I was like, "All right,
All right, fine. Totally fine.
Nature finds a way.
nature
Exactly.
finds a way.
Yeah.
This is
Reclaiming
what
its
it is."
own. That's awesome. Cam and I were talking before the show started about still temperatures and the sort of the gradient temperatures that one might experience over the course of running a still run, which kind of led me to wonder: the stills that you're using currently, are they steam jacketed? Are they coils? Are they direct fire? What do you have going on there?
Yeah, so I used to work on direct fire. At Privateer, we have steam. So the Vendome copper pot still is an internal steam coiler, and that's wonderful. It's a workhorse. And then the other stills we have are steam jackets, and I love those. So for us, it takes about an hour to probably fire it up till the time where the helmet at the top of the still will be like 155 Fahrenheit, and that's when I know like vapor's starting to make its way over. And that's when I start making decisions about, how hard I want to run a dephlegmator to hold it back and let things separate out in the still. So yeah, the top of our helmet will race up to like 176, 177. And then the ghost pipe, which is the pipe that goes right into the condenser, will usually be 1 degree cooler because of the time the vapor's gone through the system. It's been naturally cooled. And some distillers, they'll set that temperature on that ghost pipe to alert them when to make a cut. We do all our cuts by taste. So temperature is a lovely guide, but we do everything to taste. So yeah.
Wow. That's impressive as hell.
Having experience with both direct fire now, as well as steam coils, what would be some of, in your mind, the pros and cons to working with each?
Yeah, great question. I love the steam coils because you have really good safety. It's really, really helpful in the safety situation. You want to make sure you have like proper pressure relief valves and all that stuff. And you're blowing out your boiler and all that good stuff for safety. But it's not an open flame in the distillery, which honestly is a very wise choice to make. But you still get enough heat that you're toasting the yeast, which is really important. So we actually stir up our lees, our dead yeast, so that they go into the still and are part of the distillation for the flavor creation that they give. There's different philosophies there. I know a lot of Scotch is clear wort, but I like the leesiness of it. So I really like having the steam for that. We still get a good toast, whereas like I really don't like any of the electric ones. I don't dig those, but steam, great, good control. The direct fire is really romantic. When I got to distill at the Mount Vernon George Washington distillery.
Oh, nice.
We got to help them make their very first rum ever. It was so cool. Like feeding the fires with actual wood that was chopped outside and like maintaining the coals just right. And like, oh, we need it though over here. Oh, there's too much fuel. We got to get the coals down. It was great. I loved it. And the wood smoke, that smell, like a lot of the Haitian Clarens will have that charred bagasse smell where the fermenters are right nearby and they pick up some of that smoke.
Oh, nice.
I love that. But with the direct fire, a lot of them are propane, and there's like a propane fire, sort of like a campfire, but much fancier than that. And that's what a lot of them are. And man, I got to tell you, like calling to order propane in time is a nightmare. So you're going to run out of propane. It's going to suck. And also, just the risks of like, in Redwood Valley, the really wild wildfires. There were a couple years where the propane tanks for the distillery were at risk because of the fires. That's just really scary to have next to a distillery. So
oh goodness, yeah.
for us, having a steam generated boiler is much lower risk. And I think the flavor is really, really good. I love the wood fire and the response of it, but the steam, I love the subtlety of the heat up, as opposed to like starting up a fire where you get like a pop of flame and then you have to come back down and then get the coals to get the heat back up. It's really nice. It's even. It's delicate. I really like that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I guess something I'd also like to hear your thoughts on as well, because, you know, with Scotch whiskey traditionally, you know, having its history deeply rooted in direct fire, the Mylar effect, and what that ultimately does to, you know, to new distillates. How do you kind of see, like, specifically what is traditionally been your understanding of that effect and its overall effect on distillates?
Yeah. So for me, especially the Maillard effect on the yeast, for sure, as it toasts and browns that yeast, it gives a lot of those umami, autolytic, biscuity, brioche flavors that I really like. I also think a lot of those elements, and this is, I think a lot of those elements, when they go over in distillation and oxidize and esterify out in aging, gives a lot of depth. And I almost wonder, like for us, it's key in our older aged distillates for that structure to be able to continue to improve with age, because every spirit and barrel, you know, it improves with age, it holds, and then it begins to kind of lose character if it's not structured to be aged that long. You really got to structure it for that aging arc. And for me, a big part of that structure is having a really nice low tangy pH. I think those Lee's toastings are important for us. And yeah, allowing enough flavor over in the distillation and structure for that knit character so it holds together and doesn't just go spread and flabby over extended aging. So for me, that Maillard effect is really important there. For us, working with molasses, which is already syrup, like sugar syrup, that's experienced the Maillard effect, we get a toasty richness, which I really like. And then, of course, as that further, any little residual sugars you might have left. So by the time our fermentation is done, it's just like a Scotch whiskey, wort, it's bone dry. But there might be a little molecule here, a little molecule here that's just was unfermentable. It was just the wrong shape. It didn't have the right stuff, or something else attached to it, and the yeast couldn't get at it, different organic molecule, etc. So you might get a little bit from that. But for us, it's really the lees are the big part of the Maillard effect for us. I also, having a little bit of experience in whiskey, I really love to ferment and distill on the grain. Thanks, Todd Leopold. So obviously, like any specialty grains you bring into it, like in Scotland, you know, you're bringing smoked malt that's already been toasted. It already has a Maillard effect. It's bringing to the mix. Using any kind of specialty grains, I think North American craft whiskey can get a little crazy on the specialty grains. Like, I get it. It has chocolate malt in it. Calm down. I think they could get a little out of hand. And I'm like, oh, it tastes like a chocolate milkshake. Great. Says like the lover of biscuit malt and special B. But anyways.
Put bottle of Signet away.
Yeah. It's like specialty grains are great. Also, like, I love the flavor of great malt. And for me, that's one of my best loves of Scotch, is you can taste the malt. And I just think that's great. And so, yeah, I think that you get some of the specialty grain bringing some toast. And then, of course, for me, if I'm distilling on the grain, I'm getting a lot of toastiness and a lot of richness from that. So I really love distilling on the grain when it comes to whiskeys. I think it's really good for yields too, because if you drain off the grain, there's still alcohol clinging to all of those cereals. Sometimes you wash it down like a small beer. So for folks who don't know, you like hose it down and water will run off and try to take some of it with it. But I'm like, it's good for yields. It's good for flavor. I guess I'll clean it up because it's always a mess. So.
Well, that was what I was going to ask about. Working with steam coils and a sugary fermentation base. It's going to get a little bit messy, I would imagine, in terms of like, just at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg both, there'll be silent season. That happens once a year, and there'll be a fairly thorough cleaning of things. But during distilling runs, during the distilling season, which is the bulk of the year, We're not climbing in and doing any aggressive cleaning in there. Do you get to the point where, okay, this is a mess, we've got to deal with it? Is that how that works?
It's a big conversation in rum, and not because it's sugary, because by the time fermentation's done, all the sugar has been converted to alcohol, so it's dry and tart. It's got just as much any little 1 gram per liter residual sugar that any whiskey wash would have. The trick is that molasses brings sulfur to the game. And I had a really great time talking on the Whiskey Fest in the UK last week about sulfur. We just did a seminar about sulfur is good, sulfur is bad, all in between. But molasses in particular brings sulfur to the game. So we use grade A molasses. This is a really conscious choice on our part. Grade A molasses is much less refined. It has a lot less sulfur and a lot less impurities in it. And it's more accurate to historical sugar, which would not have been as heavily refined as sugar is today. So we use grade A, so that's pretty easy on our system. It only brings so much sulfur. Obviously, you want to have a beautiful, clean copper inside of your still so that the sulfur molecules can catalyze onto them, stay in the still, and not come over in your distillate. And so for us, we do regular cleanings. We're really lucky. So at Germain-Robin, we would do a distillate. There'd be the leftover acidic, watery wine left in there. We'd take off the top, crawl into the hot, what's called mar, and scrub the horribly burnt inside of the still. It was hideous. It was awful. It was the whole thing. You're wearing like full fisherman's outfit. I'm like, I can't even describe like how weird of a job that is to people. But we would do that like middle of the season because we'd have, like you said, a distillation season. At Privateer, we have a really regular like bi-weekly cleaning where we mix vitamin C, citric acid powder, and water, and we just send it through the system, and it has little spray balls that spray it all throughout. So it cleans it right off. We rinse it out and we're good. So we're really lucky. For producers who use Blackstrap, the way people are so, white sugar is so much more valuable. They really, really extract as much white sugar as possible. It's very heavily refined. So what's left behind for Blackstrap is very different now than it necessarily used to be, and it has a lot of sulfur. And those producers have to deal with still fouling. And this will be where literally there's so much ash and stuff in it that like you kind of have to go in with like, I even heard one person say like with a chisel and a hammer and just like get the fouling out, and it can really damage your still. You just have to shut the whole facility down and dig it out pretty regularly because it just builds up so much. And so that's really intense. Some producers have found really clever ways to avoid it, which I think is kind of awesome. But yeah, it's definitely a struggle. So we're really happy we use the grade A. It also makes disposal a lot easier for us because it's much less concentrated and refined. It's just, grade A molasses that we're disposing of. And obviously in continental North America, we have a lot of environmental responsibility and disposal laws. So we have to be really careful. Whereas some distilleries in continental North America that work with Blackstrap actually have some issues getting rid of their stillage because it is so serious to be introducing into the sewer systems.
Because of the aggressive sulfur content?
Just other concentrated impurities, that kind of stuff. Yeah, ash is a big one.
So I guess what would be the net positive that would lead, a distiller to make the decision? Because from what you've described, I don't necessarily see it. So what would be the argument for a distiller to use, Blackstrap?
It's very, very affordable. And when you're buying like a lot of molasses, something like for us, it just makes perfect sense. We get better yields. It's easier to dispose of. It's easier to ferment. It's easier to work with. We're very comfortable in making that super upfront payment of that. But if you've always used Blackstrap and that's always been what you've done, it would be, a big challenge to your process to decide to make a change. And some producers use Blackstrap and will blend in grade A, or not even grade A, high test molasses. So Don Q is pretty open and transparent that they'll sometimes add in what's called high test molasses, which is like cane syrup, into their Blackstrap to up the sugar content and kind of dilute out some of those impurities. There's certain ways people are approaching it, but it does affect the still and the still's cleanliness. Just like you said, we really want that copper exposure for the esterification it causes, those fruity notes we get from it, as well as that sulfuric catalyzation that we really need.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I'm guessing, is if you're a Blackstrap user, isn't the intensity, the evaluative effect, doesn't that end up affecting the final rum flavor as well? Because aren't you really concentrating the amount of aggressive caramelization happening if you're using Blackstrap?
Absolutely.
So then the flavor profile of those whiskeys, those rums, I'm guessing, skews much more reflective of that. Is that accurate?
Depending on how they're distilled. So yes, they have the potential to have a very, very different flavor, particularly really earthy flavors. For me, if I smell a glass of rum next to a glass of bourbon, as far as like sweet aromas, the bourbon always smells so much sweeter to me than the rum, which is very earthy to me. It's a grass, it's a vegetable, it's a little bit different than a cereal grain. And so they have the potential, yes, for those deep, dark, bitter, kind of intense flavors. How they measure the sulfuric and other impurities against those aromas is really important. But if they distill to 96% ABV on a multi-column, why would they, pay any more money for a different type of substrate if that's the cheapest,
That's a really good point. And as far as like you're getting your grade A molasses in the amount to which you would dilute it into your the base that will become your fermentation base, how is that determined exactly?
Yeah. So we'll basically get a C of A, certificate of analysis, that tells us where the molasses is at. We use grade A, so it's actually legally required as a style to be within a certain spectrum. So we pretty much know what it's coming in at. And we, formulate our recipe based on how much fermentable sugar Brix concentration is there and how much water we want to add to the dilution to make sure we're fermenting to the proper ABV we want. So it's just like you would use malt syrup and dilute malt syrup with water, same exact kind of thing, based on how many fermentable sugars are there, what the Brix content is, and where you want to end up. So for us, we add enough water that we end up around 9% ABV for our fermentation, which can be considered a little low depending on who is doing what style. I like it because up to that point, the yeast remain really happy. And up over that point, the yeast can become a little bit more stressed and produce a little more impurities and stuff we don't want, especially methanol, etc. And so by the time we're done fermenting, we really top out around 9. And that means all the sugar's been converted. So you want to introduce as much sugar that as soon as it's converted to alcohol, you've hit exactly where you want to be.
Got it. Okay, so the amount of dilution would be dependent on the Brix weight of
on the molasses coming in. If we used Blackstrap, we'd use a lot more, and if we used grade A, we use a little bit less. And if you use grade B, it would be a little different. If we were using fresh pressed sugarcane is pretty cool in that when you grow sugarcane for molasses, you want sugarcane that's going to ripen really, really high. And that's really what you're looking for is sugar content. Whereas a lot of these regions, some of the reasons why there's so many laws around what can be called agricole and what is best practice for agricole is certain varietals make much better agricole. And a lot of them have a lot more aromatic properties, but they also ripen to the level of Brix that when you fresh press it out, what comes out is the right sugar concentration that you can let it ferment as is, and it gets to an appropriate ABV. Whereas if you were juicing some of these really high test, sugar canes, you would have to add water to bring it down so it wouldn't ferment up to 20, 30 ABV that you don't want. So
sure.
It's kind of interesting how even selecting the cane really determines the process. Yeah.
That I guess leads us into another really great conversation about global warming and about sustainability as well. A conversation that we're getting to always have in whiskey as well. So how does sustainability and obviously global warming start to change the varietals that of cane that are being utilized in the rum world, the greater rum world? I know that's a large universe, but
that's a great question. It's a really great question, and it's really important. A lot of the Caribbean are experiencing the consequences of global warming at a rate that is not equitable with a lot of the regions causing global warming. So it's a little intense. But yeah, I think it's a really important question. One of the things I love about rum is that it's very rarely monovarietally planted. So oftentimes when you have a big field of sugarcane, it'll have mixed varietals. And the point is that the varietal closest to the sugar mill will ripen first. You'll harvest it, you'll mill it, and then you'll drive your tractor right over the empty field to the next that has just ripened second and third. So they'll plant different varietals together, which I think field diversity is really important, and avoiding the monocropping is really important. So that's something that's a real big positive in rum. So much varietal variation. It's amazing. I love it. You know, working in sort of American spirits, I know corn plays a very small role in very specific types of whiskeys in Scotland, but here in the US, corn plays a really big role, and obviously GMO, mass-produced corn, monocropping corn is a big concern here. So in sugar, it's really nice that we have this variety, but obviously we have to bring time and attention to worker safety and where our cane is coming from. We're really lucky. We get all single origin cane. We get it all from a single mill, and they have really incredible programs for supporting worker safety, food access, etc. With the global warming question, obviously as storms intensify, it's damaging cane and cane fields. I know Don Q was really interested in planting their own cane field, and Maria came. And they were like, okay, yeah, no, we can't do this. It totally wiped the whole thing out. So yeah, it's a big question. It's a big concern. So our sugarcane mill is kind of famous for creating this technology that dry washes the cane. So instead of creating runoff water and water washing all the cane that comes through, they dry wash it. So they're not wasting that water, and that water isn't runoff contaminating red water, which is really important. So yeah, and erosion is actually a really big deal. We love volcanic hillside cane, but what are they doing to protect against erosion? Ours have a tree planting regime to kind of help support that, especially in regards of reforestation of the rainforest, which is a very big deal as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really big questions. And the way most sugarcane and molasses is bought and sold on the global commodity market, a lot of it is very faceless. It's very rare to have a place like Worthy Park that grows their own sugarcane and makes their own molasses and makes their own rum bar rum from it. That's a very, very rare. And I think there's a big misconception in consumers that, you know, everyone's using local cane and these producers, and where is sugar actually coming from? Which again is a really hard, it's a hard thing because it's controlled by such big forces. So it's hard for producers who are honestly in the run of things. A lot of them are just really small. And it's challenging for them. And I also think, you know, sometimes there can be, you know, people say, oh, I wish more distilleries in the Caribbean didn't use oil for their boilers or did this or did that. But we talk about like progress and progressive ideals. We also need to be aware of like what regions have been systematically harmed and denied access to progress before we project those same ideals. And what are we doing for that equity and that support to help them access that progress? So, you know, Worthy Park, Camden Estate, little Jamaican owned and operated places. They're not this big mega corporation of spirits industry that I think people project onto them, but they're all trying to do the right thing. I think that's really important. For us, the Flor de Caña boycotts in the US with bartenders was huge for us. I know a lot of bartenders were like, this won't change anything, blah, blah, blah. But that is something concrete and real I could take to my sugar people and say, this is why this stuff is so important, and give them context, because I think they live in, you know, a totally different world where it's like, it feels sometimes like when I'm talking to other sugar producers, I love our producer. Our producer's amazing. It's my dream producer. But talking to other producers, it sometimes feels like it's like the beef council meeting or something. And they're like, why does anyone care? Why does anyone care where it's from? And it's hard. It's hard to get that information sometimes.
How critical was it to the brand mission of Privateer to have did the relationship with the sugar producer come before the concept of the rum, or did the rum come and then you got lucky and found the exact producer that you wanted to work with?
Yeah. So when Andrew Cabot founded the company, one of his statements in his original plan was, I want to help do for sugar what's happened to coffee. And like coffee used to be bulk commodity, filed into warehouses anonymously, sold off in big lots. The idea of single origin or knowing your grower was completely unknown. So when he started the company, we definitely worked with the best people we could find that were available at our size. So we're a small producer, and still some of the coolest, most exciting farms don't make enough sugar for us to use.
Wow.
We found a biodynamic producer in Georgia that we were thrilled about, and we were like, this is amazing. We'd love to buy this. And they're like, oh, I literally make 1/100th of that in a year. And I'm like, okay, cool. Maybe we'll buy everything for 1 year, invest in you, and you can grow. Great.
Right. Does that lead to does that? So I want to. Sorry, I want to hear the rest of that point. But does that? It just kind of fired off an idea for me. Do you see those as opportunities to do one-off runs with a specific producer like that?
We do, and we have some cool stuff in the works for it, which I'm really excited about. So we definitely do. And then, so we found the producer we liked that we felt was the best, and then we just kept looking for better and better and better and better. And our standards grew, and they got higher and tougher, and we wanted more clarity. And it was amazing that Wayne Curtis wrote a great article for us that our dream molasses had actually been under our noses like the whole time, but we just always assumed like whatever. There's this great beloved local molasses, Crosby molasses, comes in like a milk carton. My husband's from Maine. He grew up on it his whole life, and we just called them and we're like, man, your molasses is the greatest. Where do you get it from? Thinking like, oh, it's probably just like Domino and repackaged, and we romanticized it. And they were like, oh, it's from this family. They bought a farm in the 70s. And I was like, what? And it was like our dream. And so it was amazing that we finally like connected with them. And so we converted to only their molasses just over 2 years ago.
That's fantastic.
It was
so
awesome.
you know what their farming practices are. You know, I mean, that's part of what's sort of blown my mind about realizing that is that within rum, particularly the larger the producer, to your point, the more it becomes a commodity, a globally traded commodity, and your ability to trace back the farming practices and the sustainability efforts of the producers of that what eventually became that molasses become impossible.
Right.
What you guys have is a provenance, a traceable provenance that not only informs why you work with them, but it also informs the consumers of your product, the provenance of what they're putting in their mouths, which is really, really impressive.
Thanks. And, as a Massachusetts rum producer, it's the first question people ask. Well, where on earth do you get sugar cane? There's no sugar cane here. But as you guys know, in whiskey, a lot of American producers aren't getting their rye from anywhere in the U.S. and people in the Caribbean are not necessarily getting their sugar from the Caribbean. So it's just, there's a lot of assumptions made, and we have to explain ourselves, and we want to feel great doing that and know we're doing the right thing and just feel really good about it. And so, the company we work with is amazing on so many levels. But like you said, we know where it literally comes from, which is not something everyone can necessarily knows. Yeah.
No, certainly not. There's one thing I wanted to ask you about. Massachusetts is clearly not the Caribbean, and at last check, I'm I'm not a map person.
Global warming, give it some time.
Yeah, it could be the next Jamaica. As I was watching this thing, they're doing this year's Wild Turkey Behind the Barrel is virtual. So I was watching Eddie Russell talk about maturation, and somebody asked about what part of the year does the best distillate happen, and since you're in a temperate to northern temperate zone, is your not necessarily the quality, but the organoleptics of the distillate that you produce in different parts of the year affected by the temperatures that you're experiencing in that part of the country?
Yes. These questions are great. I love this. I could talk to you guys all day. Absolutely. So I love the
Please
question.
do.
When is the best time a distillate can be made? For us, it's the best time for this distillate now. So for us, we distill a lot of what will become our unaged rum, our New England white rum, or we did a little thing with Kate Perry when in rum. That was really fun. Like a single one-off where she came up and distilled with us in the before times. So in the cold weather, we like to make a lot of our unaged stuff because it's really cool around the still. You get more intense reflux and you get more lighter, more delicate aromatics coming over and a little less of that confident back palate weight coming over. They're a little more fore palate, a little bit fresher, a little bit more aroma driven. So we do most of our distilling of our unaged products then. And then our aged products we love to do when the weather is much warmer.
Oh, wow.
And kind of there's a lot warmer air around the still, so there's just less reflux. And we get bigger, bolder, that back palate, confident, heavyweight, a lot more breadth, a lot more roundness. So we kind of harness the seasons for that seasonality, kind of coming from like Germain Robin. I loved the seasonality and like you felt like you really moved through the wheel of the year. So we kind of like recreating that a little bit for us. And then the way it ages, these cool, slow winters, we get a lot more dissolved oxygen. Yes! Oh, I love that. I love that. Yay. So in the winter, when a liquid is cold, it holds a lot more dissolved gas. So we get a lot more dissolved oxygen in suspension, meaning the type of esterification we're going to get is going to be that delicate, fruity, light stuff. Summer comes around. So our winters are really dry as well. So we get a lot more water evaporation and our proof goes up in barrel. It goes up to like 122. Goes up. So we go into barrel at 110 and it can go up to like 120, 122 in the winter. Then over the summer, it gets really warm. All the grain expands and it's really, really humid. So we lose alcohol. So our alcohol proof goes down and it can really dip down around 105 at the height of summer. Wow. And then it starts to get cool again. And when we get that squeeze of the grain, it's happening right now. We actually just took a sample 4 weeks ago and we're planning a sample next week because as the grain crunches down on it, it's going to push all that rum into suspension and the color drops in the cask. The color will get much deeper because all that rum that's up in the wood gets pushed in. We get little leaks. We have to watch for leaks in winter as the grain contracts. So yeah, that seasonality is really important. So when we harvest barrels, we harvest in very specific windows in spring and fall. So our Navy Yard, which is a cask strength bottling, we know that to be true to style, we want it between like 108 and 115 proof. And any higher than that, it starts to mess up bartenders' recipes. It's not meeting customer expectation. Any lower than that, I don't feel like that's really like cask strength, which is like what we're going for. So we know the specific window we can harvest the casks and they're sort of in that range. So we got to catch them at the right time. And if one is kind of coming out of summer and it's really spread and it doesn't have enough like structure and it's just a little loosey goosey and we want it to have more seriousness to it, we'll let it go through the winter. And we know when we catch it that spring, it will have tightened up. The alcohol would have gone up. It'll get a little more structure. That oak will have gone into solution. It'll give it a little more structure on the palate and it'll really come out ready to go. Whereas something tastes really, really, really firm, in spring, I know, okay, I'll let it go another summer. It'll soften out. It'll flesh out. It'll get richer. So we're really playing with seasonality a lot at our distillery.
That's fantastic. This is we're yeah, exactly. We're past an hour, and I'm supremely thankful that you've agreed to join us next week because there's so much left to talk about. It's kind of blowing my mind. So I got a couple questions. I just wanted to make sure that they got answered both by my pal Mike Aiken, who joined us a little bit late. So he's asked for a recap of the still setup, and then I'll hit you with his second question, which since you have a background in the whiskey industry, I thought I knew until I just heard your description of how ABV in the barrel changes from year to year. I mean, fluctuates up and down depending on what the season is. So if you could just quickly run through the still setup at Privateer for Mike's sake, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything is first distilled in a Louisville Kentucky Vendome copper pot still. And then second distillation is done in a Christian Carl hybrid still, which means we can either run it as a pot still, where the line arm goes, it goes from the pot line arm over to the condenser, or we can flip that line arm down and it goes into a single batch column that has 8 plates. And those plates are all flexible, so we can decide exactly how many plates we want. And then that goes to the condenser. So either pot or column, however we see fit.
So do the plates, is that how that works? You just rotate the orientation of the plate, or you take them out?
So there's like a little, this is a great question. And no, I like always heard like, oh, you flip the plates. Like I always thought like it would turn, right?
Yeah.
And then when I got to actually adjust my first still, I was like, oh, it's actually like, you'll see a stainless steel handle. And when I pull on that handle, it lifts up like a little stopper, almost like a stopper you would see in a shower. It lifts that up, and the vapor can just go right up through it.
So it rotates clear out of the, and it isn't just that it reduces its profile within, like on an axis. It rotates clear up and out of the spirit vapor stream. Is that how I'm understanding?
It's like the plate is like this, and the dome cap is here.
Oh, yes. Okay, got it.
Off to the side is like a little plunger, and you just lift the little plunger up.
Ah, nice.
And it just, like,
okay.
it just goes right up and through. And I'm like,
oh, that's fantastic.
Oh, that's all it is?
Sure, because they're bubble plates in it, so there wouldn't be. I see.
Wow,
that's really cool.
Familiar with this, I'm sure.
Yes, I have it on my desk right this minute, as a matter of fact.
This is our still. There's a couple photos of our still in here. I got to travel with them a little bit and kind of
really
on this. So it's really, I took them to bourbon country, which was amazing. It was their first time. And so we had some good times, but there's a couple diagrams in here. So this is essentially the Privateer still.
What? Now, what page are you on? I'm sorry.
I am on page 45.
45, got it.
And you're going to see the rectification plate.
Got it. So
essentially imagine right next to, see the downspout on the left?
Yes.
Imagine next to that, literally just a little stopper. And that's what you would pull out. It's like a little circle the size of a quarter.
Yep.
And that's what opens the plate so that it's not forced to go through the bubble mechanism. It can just go up and around and bypass it.
Ha! That is cool as hell. Wow.
Yeah, so this buddy is essentially the Privateer still. For anyone who has the textbook, page 51.
51, and that's the page I was on. Oh, nice. I wondered the one that looks like it has a little trolling motor jammed into the pot still there. The typical hybrid still diagram. Wow, very, very cool. And next week I will ask you in some depth about the deflammator. And its role in what you do, and the decisions that you make regarding how to run it. Let me hide that question. Where'd it go? Oh, that's being hidden. So then the next. Mike has that same question, and I don't know the answer. I was always under the impression in Scotland that in most but not all circumstances, the violent predominance of circumstances, that ABV is going to drop at a regular rate via almost a formulaed rate from year to year, so that you have a pretty strong sense where you're going to be 5 or 10 years out. But I never even thought of, if you took that month by month, is there an up and down that happens on the whiskey side of things? I don't have any idea how I'd answer that. Any insights that you'd like to share with us there?
It would depend a lot on humidity. Plays a really.
It might just be me.
Can you hear me? Okay. Great.
You still have audio? Okay, it's just me then. Go for it.
I'll keep going. Let me know comments if people can't hear me. For me, humidity plays a really big role. How much moisture in the air? If there's a lot of water in the air, the water is less excited to go there. So when you start to study wine and you start to study sherry, you'll learn about the warehouses and the bodegas they put right next to the ocean, and the bodegas that they put inland where it's dry. And the bodegas next to the ocean, they'll actually spray water all over the floor to increase the humidity because they want the proof to continue to go down in barrel, which is really important to them. So if you have a lot of humidity, which in Scotland you do year round, your general trend will be down in alcohol. Same with the Caribbean. The Caribbean is very humid. They lose large volumes, and the volume they lose is almost all alcohol because the proof is always going down because the humidity is always high. Here in Massachusetts, we have really strange weather. It gets to 100 degrees very easily every summer, which is much hotter than most places in the Caribbean. There's like a couple weeks a year, my Caribbean friends like to send me teasing texts like, it's 85. And I'm like, it's 103. I'm like cooking here. So like, we get peaks in the summer. And then obviously it's a very cold here all winter. But we do get that big shift in humidity, which is very unique and different as well. Those dry winters, they make a really big difference for us. So in Scotland, I'm sure that there's times where it's higher and lower. I did a great presentation on terroir of the cellar with our friends from E&A Shear in Amsterdam talking about humidity and loss rates as well. Another thing is, what encourages loss is how much alcohol is actually in the barrel to begin with. And in the Caribbean, they tend to go into barrel at like 140 to even 60, 80 proofs. There's a lot of alcohol in there. So when evaporation happens, a lot more alcohol is going to evaporate out. So that's going to accelerate your rate as well. Whereas we are at 110, there's just less alcohol that's going to evaporate at the natural standard. So if you adjusted the proof to be even, it might account for a point or two of evaporation. But obviously the constant warmth and humidity means they're just going to consistently lose alcohol in the Caribbean. And of course, what will evaporate in your ambient temperatures tends to evaporate off pretty aggressively in the first few years. And then your rates of evaporation drop significantly in the later years because what's can evaporate has. You still lose bits, but it goes from for us, it's like 5-6%, 5-6%, 4%, 4%, 3%, 2%, and then it starts to calm down.
I need to remember to write down. Actually, I should just do it right now to talk about barrel entry proofs next week as well, because that'll have I think we'll have a lot of really great conversation between us as well as having Brendan on the chat for that as well.
Right, and one of the other things that I'm going to write this one down too. This whole idea of a trend in low gravity worts and your opinions regarding that sort of thing as well. So there's a whole bunch to talk about again next week, which is very exciting. Maggie, wow, that was amazing. I'm totally going back and watching this in the recorded form as soon as I can, taking mad notes. You probably get a couple of panicky emails from me as I move forward in WSET3. But we can't thank you enough for the time that you've devoted to us today. And we're really, really looking forward to chatting with you again next week. Cam, if you've got anything that any last questions for Maggie before we sign off, feel free.
No last questions. I've got a page full of notes over here, and I'm very excited for next week as well. Thank you so much for your expertise and your time as well. This was incredible.
Thank you guys. It's been really fun. I was so excited when you guys asked. I was like, they're so cool. This is awesome. I love Ardbeg. It's really cool for me to be here. And yeah, if you guys have study questions, I am here as someone who has been there. I've done it. It's challenging, and I can absolutely answer any questions you guys have.
That's fantastic. Maggie Campbell from Privateer Rum. Thanks again, Cam. You've got your Monday through Friday show that you do, Whiskey Through Food, 5 p.m. Eastern on Facebook and YouTube. So anybody who's checking us out now, please check in for that. You'd find that at on your Facebook page, and you got a YouTube channel now, yeah? The Ardbeg YouTube channel, which is fantastic. We do this every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Highlands to Islands will be back next week. I believe we'll be joined. I heard from Brendan during the show. We will be joined by Brendan again next week, and I'm sure Lew was detained by the conversation that you left to come to this one. So thanks again for that. Looking forward to chatting with you next week. Again, thanks so much for your time. Thanks everybody for joining us. And we'll be back next week for part 2 of Highlands to Islands with a discussion of stills with Maggie Campbell, Lew Bryson, and Brendan McCarron. Thanks everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Bye guys. Thank you.
We'll see you.